Chapter 2, Communication and Perception. So perception is the process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting information, while perception is primarily cognitive and psychological. How we perceive the people and events, objects around us affects our communication. So the first step of that is selecting information. This is when we focus our attention on certain incoming sensory information that's going on. So think about how, out of many other possible stimuli to pay attention to, you may hear a familiar voice in the hallway, see a pair of shoes you want to buy from across the mall, or smell something cooking for dinner when you get home from work. We quickly cut through and push to the background all kinds of things around us, all kinds of stimulus, sights, smells, sounds, etc. And then we decide what we want to select to focus on and what we want to ignore. So sometimes you may be in a place with a close friend or a family member, and your eye immediately goes to something and you're like, oh my gosh, did you see that? And they're like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And it takes you forever to get them to focus on what you're focusing on. That's because they've selected something different and their focus is taken somewhere different. So we tend to pay attention to information that is salient. Salience is the degree to which something attracts our attention in a particular context. The thing attracting our attention can be abstract, it can be a concept, or it can be an object, a concrete object. For example, a person's identity as a Native American may become salient when they are protesting at the Columbus Day Parade in Denver, Colorado. Or a bright flashlight shining in your face while camping at night is sure to be salient. The degree of salience depends on three features. We tend to find things salient that are visually or orally stimulating and things that meet our needs or interest. So next, we'll look at visual and oral stimulation. So these are things that become salient in our perception field and get our attention. This stimulates our sense. It isn't always a positive thing, but it does. So nonverbal adapters or nervous movements we do to relieve anxiety, like pacing or twirling our hair, can be distracting. Aside from minimizing distractions and delivering our message enthusiastically, the content of our communication also affects salience. So sometimes our nonverbals distract, it being something that's in someone's face in a powerful message, but it kind of varies depending on the situation. So it's probably not surprising to learn that visually and orally stimulating things become salient in our perception field and get our attention. Creatures ranging from fish to hummingbirds are attracted to things like silver spinners on fishing poles or red and yellow bird feeders. Having our senses stimulated isn't always positive. Think about the couple that won't stop talking during the movie, or the upstairs neighbor whose stereo system or subwoofer shakes your ceiling at night. In short, stimuli can be attention-getting in a productive or distracting way. As communicators, we can use the knowledge to benefit by minimizing distractions when we have something important to say. It's probably better to have a serious conversation with a significant other in a quiet place rather than a crowded food court. As we will look later, there's different things that we can do with our voice to kind of adjust that. And in addition to that, like we mentioned a second ago, we can do things like nonverbal adapters or nonverbal movements that we do to relieve our anxiety, also can be distracting from the message we're trying to deliver. Needs and interests. I think this will make sense, is that we tend to pay attention to information that we perceive to meet our needs or our interests in some way. This type of selective attention can help us meet instrumental needs and get things done. And I always use the example of when you're in class and maybe you've zoned out quite a bit, but then your teacher says something and this will be on the test, and all of a sudden you perk up and you really focus on that stimulus. Expectations. The relationship between salience and expectations is a little more complex. We find expected things salient and find things that are unexpected salient. So basically, we can find expected things salient and find things that are unexpected salient. While this may sound a little contradictory, a couple of examples will illustrate it. If you're expecting a package to be delivered, you might pick up to the slightest noise of a truck engine or someone's footsteps approaching your door. Since we expect something to happen, we may be extra tuned in to clues that it's happening or coming. In terms of the unexpected, if you have a shy and soft-spoken friend who you overhear raising the volume and pitch of their voice while talking to another friend, you may pick up on that and assume that something out of the ordinary is going on. For something unexpected to be salient, it has to reach a certain threshold of difference. If you walked into your regular class and there were one or two more students than normal, you may not notice. But if you walked into your class and there was someone dressed up as a wizard, you'd probably take notice. So if we expect to experience something out of the routine, like a package delivery, we'll find the stimuli we need related to that expectation. If we experience something that we weren't expecting that is significantly different from our routine, then we will likely find it salient also. So it can be contradictory. So organizing information. The second part of the perception process is when we categorize and we organize information that we perceive based on innate and learned cognitive patterns. So there's three ways that we sort into patterns. We use proximity, similarity, and differences. We also organize interactions and interpersonal experiences based on our first-hand experience. So we group things based on similarity. We tend to think similar looking or similar acting things belong together. In the book it says, I have two friends that I occasionally go out with, and we are all three males around the same age, of the same race, with short hair and glasses. Aside from that, we don't really look alike. But on more than one occasion, a server at a restaurant has assumed that we're brothers, despite the fact that many of our other features are very different. The salient features are organized based on similarity, and the three of us are suddenly related. We also organize information that we take in based on difference. In this case, we assume that the item that looks or acts different from the rest doesn't belong with the group. Perceptual errors involving people and assumptions of difference can be especially awkward if not offensive. The book says, my friend's mother, who is a Vietnamese American, was attending a conference at which another attendee assumed she was a hotel worker and asked her to throw something away for her. In that case, my friend's mother was a person of color at a convention with mostly white attendees. So an impression was formed based on the other person's perception of the differences. So these strategies of organizing information are common that are built into how we teach children basic skills and how we function in our daily lives. I think we've all looked at pictures in grade school and determined which things went together and which things didn't belong. If you think of the little act of organizing something like your desk at home or your closet or something in your house, we organize like things together. We put like things together. But when we do that in our perception process, we can make errors. So we also organize interactions and interpersonal experiences based on our first-hand experience. When two people experience the same encounter differently, misunderstandings and conflict may result. Punctuation refers to the structuring of information into a timeline to determine the cause. So we have the stimulus, we have the cause, and we have the effect, the response of our communication interactions. Applying this concept to interpersonal conflict can help see us how the perception process extends beyond the individual to the interpersonal level. The concept also helps illustrate how organization and interpretation can happen together and how interpretations can influence how we organize information and vice versa. So how does the conflict begin and end? The answer is it depends on the people involved in the conflict and how they punctuate or structure their conflict experience. Punctuation differences can escalate a conflict, which can lead to a variety of relationship problems, or between the two people, they can talk those things out, discuss the differences, and then settle things in a quicker process. Interpretation is the third part of the perception process. It's in which we assign meaning to our experiences using mental structures known as schemata. Schemata are like databases of stored related information that we use to interpret new experiences. So think of it this way. All of our experiences in life, we've stored in some way, whether we realize it or not. But we have an overall schema about education and how we interpret experiences with teachers and classmates. So how was that developed? It started when we were in kindergarten. It started with our interactions with teachers and our relationships with teachers as we went through school. So when we meet a new teacher, if we meet a new instructor, if we think of the prospect of having a new teacher, that history that we have, that schema that we have built up, those things impact how we see the present situation. So this happens with everything in our life, that basically consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously, when we have an interaction, we go back to our history of similar or comparable interactions, and we kind of then interpret how this interaction is going to be. So based on my experience, this is what I'm expecting here. We need to be aware of when schemata affects and our interpretations affect our behavior. If you're doing a group project for a class and you perceive a group member to be shy based on your schema of how shy people communicate, you may avoid giving them responsibility in your group because you don't think they'll be a good public speaker. It can also guide our interactions, providing a script for our behaviors. We know in general how to act and how to communicate in a waiting room or in a classroom or on a first date. Every person who has ever been in a similar situation knows how to act in those situations. But it's used to interpret others' behaviors and forms of impression about who they are as a person. To help this process along, we often solicit information from people to help us place them into a pre-existing schema. So we take little signals from people and then we assign a schema based on our past interactions, and that helps with interpretation. So perceiving others. Attribution and interpretation. So have you asked this question to yourself? Are you a good judge of character? How quickly can you size someone up? Research shows that many people are surprisingly accurate at predicting how an interaction with someone will unfold based on initial impressions. Fascinating research has also been done on the ability of people to make judgment about a person's competence after as little as 100 milliseconds of exposure to a politician's faces. Even more surprising is that people's judgments of competence after exposure to two candidates for a Senate election accurately predicted election outcomes. In short, after only minimal exposure to a candidate's facial expressions, people made judgments about the person's competence, and those candidates judged more competent were people who actually won the election. So this is going to kind of tell us about how we make those perceptions of others. So the first thing we're going to talk about is attribution and interpretation. Okay. Attribution. In most interactions, we are constantly running an attribution script in our mind, which essentially tries to come up with the explanation for what is happening. Why did my neighbor slam the door when she saw me walking down the hall? Why is my partner being extra nice to me today? Why did my office mate miss our project team meeting this morning? In general, we seek to attribute the cause of others' behavior to internal or external factors. So, attribution are explanations for what is happening. We are constantly running an attribution script in our mind. So internal attributions connect the cause of behaviors to personal aspects such as personality traits. External attributions connect the cause of behaviors to situational factors. Fundamental attribution errors refers to our tendency to explain others' behaviors using internal rather than external attributions. And self-serving bias is a perceptual error through which we attribute the cause of our successes to internal personal factors while attributing our failures to external factors beyond our control. So when we observe people and we make attribution errors, we make a perception error about them, then we're applying things to them, applying things to their interactions, applying things to their personality that really shouldn't go there. So when we look at fundamental attribution error, there's an example in your book. When I worked at an urban college in Denver, Colorado, I often had students come into class irritated saying, "I got a parking ticket. I can't believe those people. Why don't they get a real job and stop ruining my life?" If you Google some clips from the reality television show Parking Wars, you will see that people often direct their anger at parking enforcement officers. In this case, illegally parked students attribute the cause of their situation to the malevolence of the parking officer, essentially saying they got a ticket because the officer was mean, because the officer was bad, which is an internal attribution. Students were much less likely to acknowledge that the officer was just doing his or her job. That's an external attribution, and the ticket was a result of the student's decision to park illegally. So, we got a ticket by this person because they're a horrible person. It has nothing to do with the fact that we parked illegally, and their job is to hold us responsible. And we often make perception errors based on a self-serving bias. That means it serves us to make the error that we make. The professor-student relationships offers a good example of how these concepts can play out. I've often heard students who earned an unsatisfactory grade on an assignment attribute that grade to the strictness, unfairness, or incompetence of their professor. I've also heard professors attribute a poor grade to the student's laziness, attitude, or intelligence. In both cases, the behavior is explained using an internal attribution and is an example of a fundamental attribution error. So, could it be that the student, from their perspective, didn't do well on the assignment because they didn't work ahead of time, they didn't follow instructions, they may not have submitted it on time, they didn't follow a rubric? And on the flip side, is it possible from the professor's side that the student didn't do well because they didn't clearly understand what to do? But oftentimes we make perception errors based on to serve us, that kind of makes us look a little bit better and the other person look not so well. So think about this. I've heard people say this through the years when I'm working in the school setting, which is, that person did well on the test, but it was really easy. They made a 99, but that was an easy test. But then the next test rolls around. Well, I made a 99, but I studied. I worked very hard for that test. It was hard and it was very difficult, and that's why I made my grade. So someone else may have made their grade because it was super easy, or they did really bad because because they didn't study enough. But when I do well, it's because I worked really hard, or when I fail, it's because the test was unreasonably difficult. Impressions and interpretation. So this is something we've heard our whole life about the impact of impressions. We've heard this saying, you never get a second chance to make a good impression. And a lot of that has is largely to do with perception. As we perceive others, we make impressions about their personality, their likability, and their attractiveness, and other characteristics. I don't know if any of you have done this, but I've taken part in many interview committees in my professional life and through my church, and I often have to stop myself because I do make fairly quick judgments. I think other people would say. I make very quick perception, come to conclusions about the person based on a variety of things. Kind of like the thing in the beginning, I am usually right, and I'll remind people of that if they don't listen to me and we get someone complicated or difficult that we're working with. But I'm typically right in my impression of the person and my analysis of the situation. And some of you may say the same thing, that you get accused of being judgmental and making quick judgments, but you might do that, but typically they're accurate. So I think sometimes this happens with first impressions. First impressions are enduring because of the primacy effect, which leads us to place more value on the first information we received about a person. And then recency effect leads us to put more weight on the most recent impression we have of a person's communication over earlier impressions. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I worked with an English teacher. I was a counselor on a campus where he was hired. And I remember when I first met him, I thought, this is going to be awful. He would barely look me in the eye, or any other coworker for that matter. He was not a new teacher. He was experienced. Very little eye contact, very little interaction with others. Very difficult to get a conversation, have a conversation with him. And I thought, this is not going to go well. These middle school students are going to eat him alive. And then as the semester began to evolve, there'd be times that I would walk by his classroom, and I would watch this teacher that had very little to say around the rest of the adults come alive in a classroom with students. And he taught those students in a way that it pulled them in. He was very he had a lot of expression. He had a lot of charisma in the classroom with students, and they loved him. And he was an excellent English teacher. So I remember that being a very clear example of my first impression was, this is going to be a long year. And then my last impression was, if you realize he has a little different personality in dealing with adults, you will get an outstanding person working on your campus. And he ended up leaving our school and put me down as a reference every time he went to a new school. And that was one thing I tried to tell them is, oh, you've got an excellent English teacher. He may not have a lot of personality and interaction with others on the campus, but he is excellent with students. The physical and environmental influences on perception. We have a general schema regarding how to dress and groom for various situations, ranging from formal to business casual to lounging around the house. So we know that we have in our mind what is acceptable in that environment. So then when someone doesn't do what we perceive as acceptable, we kind of get thrown off by that. We're not going to go into the halo and horns effect. That's in your book and in your notes. Culture, race, gender, sexual orientation, class, ability, nationality, and age all affect the perception that we make. The schemata through which we interpret what we perceive is influenced by our cultural identifiers. So perception starts with the information that comes through our senses. Personality refers to a person's general way of thinking, feeling, and behaving based on underlying motivations and impulses. These underlying motivations and impulses from our personality traits, they are fairly enduring once a person reaches adulthood. So I don't know if any of you have ever taken a personality test. We're going to do a brief assessment in this class when we talk about intrapersonal communications and kind of look a little deeper at how that impacts our communication. We know that there's extroversion and introversion are what we think of as the most common. We have agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, openness, and there's something else there that I missed. Oh, I just put in neuroticism twice. There's only 5. Assumed similarity refers to our tendency to perceive others as similar to us. When we don't have enough information about a person to know their key personality traits, we fill in the gaps, and we usually assume that they possess traits that are similar to the traits that we see in ourselves. So perceiving and presenting self. Self-concept refers to the overall idea of who a person thinks he or she is. The looking glass self explains what we see ourselves reflected in other people's reactions to us, and then form our self-concept based on how we believe other people see us. Social comparison theory states that we describe and evaluate ourselves in terms of how we compare to other people. Self-esteem we know as the judgments and evaluation we make about our self-concept. Self-efficacy refers to the judgments people make about their ability to perform a task within a specific context. Self-discrepancy states that people have beliefs about and expectations for their actual and potential selves. They don't always match up with what they actually experience. Our actual self, attributes that you or someone else believes you actually possess. Ideal self are those things that we want to possess. And ought self contributes you or someone else believes you should. I should have this. I ought to have this. Culture, we have self-enhancement bias, meaning that we tend to emphasize our desirable qualities relative to other people. And think about how media impacts our perception. And I would say you can do social or mass media and how that impacts how we feel about ourselves. In terms of self-concept, media representations offer us guidance on what is acceptable or unacceptable and valued or not valued. But I'd also say that it does offer us a lot of information on things that are attainable and unattainable. And sometimes media, social media, mass media shove things that are unattainable for the average person in our faces, and it makes us feel like it should be attainable for us. Self-presentation is the process of strategically concealing or revealing personal information in order to influence others' perceptions. Pro-social self-presentation entails behaviors that present a person as a role model and make a person more likable and attractive. Self-serving self-presentation entails behaviors that present a person as highly skilled, willing to challenge others, and someone not to be messed with. So how can we improve perception? Self-concept cannot be defined as right or wrong, but rather negative or positive. So these are some barriers to positive self-perception. We need to avoid reliance on rigid schema. Not every current situation fits in a schema from our past. Be critical of socializing forces. So think about things that are pushing you to see things a certain way because that's what the whole does. Be aware of self-fulfilling prophecies. I'm never going to be able to do this. I know I'm not going to be able to do this. And so guess what? I can't do this. I'm going to start this diet, but just like the 1,000 diets before, I'm going to fail at it. And so guess what? I start it, and in a few days I fail because I knew I would fail. Create and maintain supporting interpersonal relationships. Having a good support system around you helps your self-perception to be positive. Be aware of distorted patterns of thinking and acting. Be aware of if you feel something about yourself that's negative, and everyone around you is telling you that's not true, that's not what the case is, be aware that sometimes we distort things in our mind. We don't see ourselves the way others see us. We apply faults to ourselves that others don't see. And so be aware when that's something that we're doing. To overcome barriers, we need to develop empathetic listening skills. We need to listen carefully to those people around us, really listen to what they're telling us, listen with our heart and our mind. Be aware of stereotypes and prejudice that inch in our perception process. Engage in self-reflection and perception checks. So think, okay, I met this person, I made a very quick judgment about them, and I was wrong. So I want to go back and figure out, why did I make that quick judgment, and how can I correct that in the future? Our perception is such a huge part of our world, and it's important that's how we start. That's the lens in which we see everything else around us. So it's important that we approach things as positively as possible, but also with wisdom, so that we make the right choices and judgments in our interactions with others.